everyone, today we're going to talk about classical Greece and Persia. Greece's geography had a big impact on how it developed in the classical period. So Greece is very mountainous and it has a lot of islands. As a result of that, it developed into independent city-states, meaning that Greece did not develop as a united empire or civilization. It developed as little independent cities that were kind of like their own countries. This geography also meant that fishing and sea trade were really important economic activities for the Greeks. The first Greek city-states were monarchies where they had a king, later abolished in favor of tyranny, which in this case just means one ruler, or were ruled by the aristocracy. The polis is the Greek city-state, which was where we get our word politics. Even though the Greeks were very divided, they had two commonalities that tied them together. First of all, they had a common language. So they adopted an alphabet that was originally made by the Phoenician people of the Mediterranean. This is different from the other forms of writing that we've seen before, like hieroglyphics of Egypt, for example. In hieroglyphics of Egypt, there were thousands of symbols that someone had to learn. The Greeks had an alphabet similar to ours, where they had a set number of letters, like we have 26 letters, and then used those to make all the other words. Another thing that they had in common was a common polytheistic religion. The Greeks had many different gods and goddesses. They believed that the gods and goddesses lived on a place called Mount Olympus, and they had religious festivals. So like the Olympics, which I'm sure you've heard of, actually started as a religious festival where the different Greek city-states would get together. Now they did have athletic contests at those festivals, but the main purpose was first and foremost religious. The Greeks had what we consider kind of an impersonal religion. And what I mean by that is in a lot of religions, the god or gods is kind of almost like what you're supposed to be like. Like they have high morals and you're supposed to follow their example. If you know anything about mythology, the Greek gods often did really terrible stuff like murder and adultery and even incest. So they were not something that you wanted to model yourself after. In some ways, they kind of showed like the downfall or the pitfalls of being a human. So we say also they had human-like characteristics. The first city-state we'll talk about is Athens. Athens had a direct democracy where they had an assembly that met every 10 days and all male citizens could participate. This is different from our democracy because we have a representative democracy. So I can vote and I vote for congressmen or senators who represent me. So I don't actually make the laws myself. I vote for a representative who then goes to Washington, D.C. or Austin, Texas to create those laws. In Greece, if you were a male citizen in Athens, you would actually go there and make the laws yourself. Like you could participate in the debate and in the votes. So that's why it's called direct democracy. They also had a council of 500, which is the bureaucracy, who ran the day-to-day affairs of the government. They also had law codes that helped govern society, but individual rights were not clearly defined. So I say that because I don't want us to overstate the Greek democracy. It was a democracy and it's the first in the world, but not everybody had rights and people still didn't have like freedom of speech or freedom of the press or these things that we associate with a democracy. Those rights were not there. It really is just that people participated in making the laws and the decisions that govern them. Most Greek city-states had an acropolis, which was a high point in the city that they used as a center of defense or government. This is the Athenian Acropolis, and on top of the Acropolis is probably the most famous building in Greece, the Parthenon, which was a temple to the goddess of the city of Athens, Athena. Here you can see what it looks like today, and then there's an illustration that shows what it may have looked like at the time. So a lot of these buildings that we see in Greece and Rome later on would have been highly painted. So they have all this sculpture, and today it just looks like white marble or white stone, but they would have been highly decorated in their time period. Another important city-state in Greece was Sparta. Sparta was a very militaristic society. So boys left home at the age of 7 until about 30 for military service and training. They were a very tightly controlled society. Because their men were off in the military, they used a group of forced laborers called helots to do their farming so they could survive as a civilization. Their whole goal was to conquer more territory, and they basically set out to conquer their neighbors. Because they wanted everyone to be totally focused on this militaristic society, they really discouraged things like travel, education, philosophy, and new ideas. So they didn't want anything to get in people's heads that could maybe distract them from the goal of military service. So the Golden Age of Athens is a time period when Athens was rebuilt after a war it had with its neighbor Persia. This guy in the statue, Pericles, was an aristocrat or a wealthy person who extended direct democracy and helped to get a lot of different projects built within Athens. So it's a time of great expansion of culture. Greece is the origin of theater. So the first Greek plays were tragedies, and then comedies. Sophocles, you don't need to know Sophocles, but I put him in there because he's a famous Greek playwright, and in English too, at least they used to, I think you still will, read something by Sophocles this year. And here's an illustration of the type of theater. The amphitheater comes from Greece. So this outdoor semicircle theater is where their plays were performed. And then there's an image of the ruins of one today in Athens. Philosophy also developed, so remember the Greeks had a religion, but it wasn't a real personal religion. People gave money and offerings to the gods because they still felt like the gods controlled things and they wanted good things to happen, but it didn't necessarily help you, like if you're in a crisis situation, or help you determine how you should live your life, or things like that that we think other religions probably do. And so the Greeks instead turned to philosophy to explain the world around them. I'm going to put a link to another short video, which is going to tell you a little bit about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So when you're done, you can watch that video and get a little more information about those people. The Greeks really focused on philosophy and rational thought as a way to understand the world. So they didn't really do science as we think of science, like with scientific method. They believed that you could think your way through everything, and so experimentation was not of much use to them. And so the result of that is, even though the Greeks came up with a lot of really important stuff, some of their ideas were wrong. A lot of their ideas were wrong that were held onto for a long time because they didn't really use science, but rather they used philosophy. The Greeks are also really known for their sculpture. Some of the characteristics of Greek sculpture is they celebrated the human body. So a lot of the sculptures feature nudes. They also feature idealistic body types. So they thought the human body should be celebrated in its most perfect form as they viewed it. And so if you look at these men depicted in the sculptures, I mean, these guys are like really buff, right? This isn't what the average person just walking around looks like. So they have this idealized body style that they portrayed in their art. And then, like I said about the buildings, the sculptures also would have been painted. So today we see them and they're just plain stone, but they would have been brightly painted in their time period. Okay, so Greece is at the bottom of this map. Greece's neighbor to the north, Macedonia, was ruled by a guy named Philip. Philip greatly admired Greece and wanted to combine it, meaning conquer it, with his civilization, Macedonia. After Philip conquered Greece, he died, and his son, who became known as Alexander the Great, took control of his empire. Alexander the Great had a huge love of Greek culture and language. So all of those cultural achievements like theater and the arts and philosophy, he wanted to spread those things throughout the rest of the world. And so that was kind of his mission as he conquered and created this huge empire, which I'll show you in a minute, he wanted to spread Greek culture and language to those places. Alexander died when he was only 32, and he did not have a successor, and so his empire was not very long-lasting, but his contribution was very long-lasting because he spread all of these elements of Greek life. So all of this together was combined into Alexander's empire. So Greece is way over on the left of the screen. He conquered through the Middle East, into Egypt down at the Nile River, through Mesopotamia, you can see the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the middle, and then all the way over to the far right, you can see the Indus River. So he made it all the way over to northern India. This was a huge empire. And again, it fell apart relatively quick after he died, but he spread Greek language and culture through this whole region. So this whole idea of spreading Greek things is called Hellenism. Hellenistic means to imitate Greeks. So as a result of this, there was a huge spread of Greek culture, learning, and language. And some of the achievements of people who lived in this empire or lived in these Hellenistic places are really long-lasting. So some of these people you've probably heard of before: Pythagoras, Euclid, Archimedes, Aristarchus. He came up with the heliocentric theory of the universe, which means sun-centered universe, which is the correct one. Ptolemy came up with the geocentric view of the universe, which is Earth-centered solar system. That idea is the one that persisted. So sometimes people say, you know, like nobody knew that the sun was the center, all these kinds of things. People have known over time, but certain theories that are wrong have, for whatever reason, become the ones that stuck. And so Ptolemy's theory of the geocentric universe is the one that stuck. He also created a number of cities named Alexandria after himself, Alexander the Great. The most famous example of Alexandria is in Egypt, and this became a huge center for learning and science. They had the largest library in the entire world was located in Alexandria, Egypt. All right, now this whole time while Greece was developing, there was another civilization, the Persians, who were developing across from the Aegean Sea. So you can see on the map Greece, and then there's a little body of water, and then over there is this big Persian Empire. The Persian Empire began in the 500s BCE under Cyrus the Great, who conquered and created really this first Persian Empire. Let me just also say that the Persian Empire has existed at different times in history. So there's different Persian empires. This one is called the Achaemenid. So I think of it almost like this is their last name. So they're all called Persia, but this is the Achaemenid one. All right, so the empire united a bunch of places. It took over Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, the Nile Valley, all into one big empire. Another really important ruler of the Persians was Darius. He supported rule with claims of divine authority. So he was given power to rule by heavenly figures. He also is really well known for dividing the empire into provinces and putting governors called satraps in charge of each province. So this is something that a lot of emperors will do, but the Persians were really just really adept at organizing this. The reason you'd want to divide your empire into provinces is it makes it easier to govern. So the emperor can have people in charge of different sections, and then they can just all report back to him. They also had inspectors that visited the provinces to make sure that the king's rules were being followed by the satraps. So they would like check up on them and make sure they were doing what they were supposed to do. And then each province also collected taxes and then sent the taxes to the central government. So again, dividing the empire into provinces and putting a satrap or governor in charge just makes it easier to control. Some other accomplishments of the Persians: they built a beautiful capital city, Persepolis, which became a major center of trade and government. They built a really extensive road system, the most famous of which is the Royal Road, which was 1,500 miles across their empire, which helped encourage trade, and then it also helped people to be able to move around and communicate better with far-flung parts of the empire. They are one of the first postal services was developed within the Persian Empire. They also developed what are called caravanserai. Caravanserai is something you're going to hear again in this class. They're almost like rest stops or motels or little inns for people traveling along the royal road by camel caravan. So caravanserai are important because they help facilitate trade. So if you're trading over a long distance, you can stop, you can rest for the night, you can get food and supplies, you can feed and rest your animals, all of those things that would be important. And then they also had a common currency throughout their empire that really helped facilitate trade as well, because having the same money as the other people you want to trade with would be really significant in enabling you to conduct business. The Persians were also known for religious toleration. So they conquered a huge territory. They had over 90 different ethnic groups within their empire. And so they allowed these different ethnic groups to keep their customs and religions as long as they paid taxes and provided soldiers to the military. Why would they do this? A lot of different empires will see practice toleration in part to help prevent revolt. Because when you're conquering people, people don't like to be conquered. And they might have a tendency to want to fight back and revolt against you. But if you allow them to keep things the same and you say you can keep your same religion and your same customs and traditions, all you have to do is pay us taxes and provide some men to go fight in our military. People are much more likely to go along with what the government is saying. To symbolize this, another Persian king, King Xerxes, built the Gate of All Nations at Persepolis to symbolize religious tolerance. So it's supposed to be like a welcoming thing, like we accept all people here. And they had a bunch of statues that represent people from like all different parts of the empire. There's also a new religion that began in the Persian Empire. Zoroastrianism is a monotheistic religion. It deals with a battle between forces of light, which represent good, and dark, which represents evil. They believed that good would eventually win, and people would be judged based on their good deeds and then go to heaven or hell. Priests helped spread this religion and idea of monotheism among mostly polytheistic people. So Zoroastrianism doesn't have a lot of followers today, but it's very significant in this region because it was kind of like an introduction to the idea of monotheism for a lot of people, because most people in the world at the time were polytheistic, and now here's a religion that preaches that there's just one God. So that was a newer concept for a lot of people. Another innovation of the Persians is the Qanat system, which is an irrigation system. This used underground tunnels, which were used to move water around to bring water to their crops. And so you can see there's an underwater channel and it flows downward through just like a slight grade through gravity. And then the farmers along the way can dig a well down into the Qanat and extract water. So why do you think they would use this, putting their irrigation system underground? It has to do a lot with their geography. So they're in the Middle East, a lot of the Persian Empire. It's very hot and dry. And so the Qanat system was really ingenious to prevent evaporation by having this whole system located underground. The Persians were also a major empire involved in trade because they're located right in the Middle East. So trade routes go off from the right. Those lines in red go off all the way to China. That's the Silk Road. They're connected, if you look at the blue lines, they're connected to trade routes on the Mediterranean Sea in the north. Below the Arabian Peninsula, that goes into the Indian Ocean, so they're connected to trade routes there. And so they have a very good location from which to facilitate trade.